6 months ago, I had a home, a husband, and a sister I would have taken a bullet for. I lost all three in the same afternoon. I remember the drive back from my shift at the hospital. I was a lab technician at St. Michael's in Toronto, and I'd just finished a double 14 hours on my feet. Coffee going cold on the counter, the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes. I remember thinking about the leftover pasta in the fridge and whether my husband had remembered to let the dog out. Those were the thoughts in my head when I pulled into our driveway on Glenrose Avenue and saw my sister's car parked out front. She lived in Mississauga. She never just dropped by. I walked in through the side door the way I always did, dropped my keys on the hook, pulled off my boots. The dog didn't come to greet me. I called out. No one answered. And then I heard voices upstairs. Low, unhurried, the kind of voices that don't belong to people who think they're about to be caught. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for probably 15 seconds. I know because I counted them after and the weeks that followed when I replayed that moment over and over, trying to find the version where I turned around and left and never had to know. I didn't turn around. My husband of 9 years was in our bedroom with my sister. She was 34. I was 38. We'd grown up sharing a room in a split level in Brampton, and I had stood beside her at her first wedding, held her hand at her divorce, driven 3 hours in an ice storm to help her move into her new apartment. I had done all of that, and none of it had mattered. He saw me first. He said my name, just my name, nothing else, like I was the one who'd done something wrong by being there. She didn't say anything at all. She just looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It wasn't guilt. It was something closer to relief. Like she was glad it was finally out. That was the moment I understood. It hadn't been a mistake. Mistakes happen fast and end in panic. This had been going on long enough that she'd made peace with it. I don't remember what I said. I remember picking up the dog's leash from the hook by the door, clipping it onto her collar, and walking back out the same way I'd come in. I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes. The dog sat on the passenger seat and licked my hand, and I stared at the front of the house I'd helped pay for, the garden I'd planted, the light in the window I'd chosen at a hardware store in Oakville on a Sunday afternoon 3 years ago, and I felt something go very quiet inside me. My husband called that evening. He wanted to talk. He said it was complicated, that he hadn't meant for it to happen, that he thought maybe we'd grown apart. I asked him how long. He said it didn't matter. I asked again. He said 8 months. Then he corrected himself. 14. I hung up. I called my closest friend from university, a woman named Colette who'd known me since our first year at Ryerson. She came over within the hour, sat with me on the floor of our mutual friend's apartment where I'd ended up that night, and let me cry until I ran dry. She was the first person I told, and for a while she was the only one who knew. She kept telling me I was allowed to fall apart. She kept saying I didn't have to hold it together yet. I was grateful for that. I needed someone to say it out loud. What I wasn't prepared for was how fast everything else moved. Within 3 weeks, my husband had begun the legal process to have me removed from the matrimonial home. I didn't understand how he moved so quickly. Later, his lawyer would explain the procedural steps like it was all perfectly normal, and maybe it was, legally. But to me, it felt like he'd had a plan already drawn up. Like the ending had been arranged while I was still thinking we were in the middle of the story. I had to find a place to stay. We had joint accounts, but he froze the primary one on the advice of his lawyer, and I was left working with what was in my personal savings. Enough for a damage deposit and first month's rent, somewhere modest, not enough for anything that felt like a home. I found a 1-bedroom in Scarborough. The baseboard heaters were loud. The shower pressure was low, and the woman upstairs walked like she was trying to break through the floor, but it was mine and I could lock the door. I applied for an emergency legal aid consultation because I couldn't afford a family lawyer on short notice, and I sat across from a woman who looked barely older than my niece and explained my situation in a voice I kept very flat and very controlled. She told me I had rights to the equity in the home because I'd been contributing to the mortgage for 9 years. She said the process would take time. Everything I was learning took time except the things that destroyed you, which happened in an afternoon. I didn't see my sister. She didn't reach out. My mother called me once, 2 weeks after everything happened, and told me she hoped I would find a way to forgive. I asked her if she'd spoken to my sister. She said yes. I asked what my sister had said. My mother paused and then told me that these things were complicated, that my sister had been unhappy in ways I maybe hadn't noticed. I thanked her for calling and said I had to go. I sat with my dog on my thin mattress in my Scarborough apartment, and I thought about what it meant to be a woman who everybody was willing to reframe as the problem because it was easier than facing what had actually happened. The weeks blurred. I went to work. I came home. I ate things that required no effort: crackers, granola bars, soup from cans I heated badly and ate lukewarm. Colette came by on weekends and brought real food and sat with me and watched bad television and didn't ask me how I was doing because we both knew the answer and saying it out loud didn't help. But some nights when she went home and the upstairs neighbors stopped walking and the building got quiet, I felt the kind of loneliness that doesn't have a name for it in polite conversation. The loneliness of someone who did everything right and lost anyway. It was on one of those nights, a Tuesday in November, when the temperature had dropped to -12 and the baseboard heater was making that sound again, that I remembered my great-aunt. Her name was Florence. She was my father's aunt, which made her my great-aunt, and she'd lived alone in a farmhouse outside of Owen Sound for as long as I could remember. She'd died 2 years earlier at 81, and the family had gathered for a small funeral and then scattered again the way families do. She'd never married. She kept to herself. My father had sometimes called her particular in a tone that meant eccentric, and my mother had simply avoided the topic of Florence altogether, which I'd always found slightly odd but never examined too closely. Florence had sent me a card when I graduated from college. She'd sent me a card when I got married. She'd never sent me anything else. But there was something in the way she wrote. Careful, exact, like each word had been chosen rather than just set down, that had stayed with me. I thought about her on that cold Tuesday night, and then I didn't think about anything else, because I fell asleep with my coat on. It was 3 weeks later when the call came. A lawyer's office in Owen Sound, a man named Mr. Calloway, very formal, who introduced himself with his full name and the name of his firm and then asked if I was the niece of Florence Ashwood by way of my father's family. I said yes. He said that Florence had left instructions that I was to be contacted following a period of 2 years after her death, if I should find myself, and I'm using his words here, in a situation of need or transition. I remember my hand tightening on the phone. He explained that Florence had arranged for a package to be held at a storage facility in Barrie, about 90 minutes from where I was living, and that I was named as the sole beneficiary of its contents. He gave me the address. He told me the access code and said the key to the unit would be in a small lockbox beside the door, combination 4 digits, the last 4 of my birth date. I didn't sleep that night. I drove to Barrie the next morning. It was early December and the highway was gray and flat, and I drove with both hands on the wheel and the heat on full and the radio off because I couldn't stand any noise. I found the storage facility, a plain industrial building on a quiet street, and I found the unit number he'd given me, and I found the lockbox exactly where he'd said it would be. The key inside it was attached to a small tag with my name written on it in handwriting I didn't immediately recognize. But I recognized the deliberateness of it, the same quality as those cards she'd sent me. Each letter placed like it mattered. Inside the unit was a wooden storage chest, the old kind with a curved lid and brass fittings. It was dusty and smelled like cedar and old paper. I knelt on the concrete floor of that storage unit in my winter coat and lifted the lid and sat very still for a moment because what I was looking at didn't feel real. There was an envelope on top, my name, again, in that careful hand. Underneath the envelope were stacks of documents, organized into labeled folders, more methodical than anything I'd ever managed in my own life. Underneath the documents were 3 things I hadn't expected: a passbook for a credit union account in Owen Sound, a sealed envelope from a law firm in Toronto that I didn't recognize, and beneath all of it, wrapped in cloth, a smaller box. I opened the envelope first. Florence had written me a letter, 3 pages, front and back, and that same careful script. I'm going to tell you what it said because it changed everything I thought I understood about my family and about her, and about the way some people spend their whole lives watching and knowing and waiting for the right moment to act. She'd been watching out for me since I was a child, not in the way that sounds, not hovering, not interfering. She'd watched from a distance, the way a person watches who knows they are not welcome in the circle but refuses to stop caring about what's inside it. She said she'd never trusted my husband, and she listed her reasons so precisely that I had to set the letter down for a moment and breathe. She'd noticed things I'd explained away. She'd kept notes. She said she hadn't wanted to interfere in my life, that she believed people had to find their own truth, but that she wasn't willing to leave this world without making sure I had a soft place to land if things went the way she feared they might. The credit union passbook showed a balance of just over $90,000. She'd been saving since my father was a young man, putting money away in a credit union account that nobody in our family had known existed. She'd worked her whole life, a bookkeeper, then an office manager, then a bookkeeper again when the company she managed closed. And she'd spent almost nothing on herself and saved almost everything, and she decided, quietly, without telling anyone, that if her grandniece ever needed it, it would be there. There was a note tucked into the passbook. It said, "This is just for getting your feet under you again. The rest is in the documents." I looked at the folders. Florence had been meticulous. She had documented, over the course of several years, what she described in her letter as a pattern of financial manipulation by my husband and his business partner, a man I'd met twice at company events and thought nothing of. Florence had somehow, and I still don't entirely understand how, because she was a woman in her late 70s living alone outside of Owen Sound, obtained copies of corporate filings, land transfer records, and financial statements that told a story I had never been told. My husband's company had a silent partner arrangement that had been structured deliberately to exclude marital assets from disclosure during divorce proceedings. He had transferred equity into this structure 18 months before our marriage fell apart. He had done it quietly and carefully, and he had done it because he'd planned this, or something like it, long enough in advance to prepare. Florence had flagged all of it. She'd organized it by date. She'd written her own summary at the front of each folder in plain language, as if she'd known I would need to hand this to a lawyer and have it make sense immediately. Tucked into the last folder was a business card for a family law firm in Toronto. Florence had written on the back, "Ask for the senior partner. Tell her Florence sent you." I drove back to Toronto that afternoon in a different state than I'd left it. Not happy. I wasn't anywhere near happy, but something had shifted. The passbook was in my bag. The folders were in a box on my back seat. For the first time in 3 months, I didn't feel like I was treading water. I felt like the ground had moved toward me. I called the law firm the next morning. The senior partner was a woman named Cynthia Laws, who had a direct way of speaking that I appreciated immediately. I told her my name. I told her Florence had sent me. There was a brief pause on the line, and then she said she'd been hoping to hear from me. She had known Florence. Not well, but for years, Florence had done her taxes, apparently back in the 90s, and they'd stayed in loose contact the way that people do when they respect each other across a professional distance. Florence had called her the previous spring, 8 months before she died, and described what she'd found and what she prepared. Cynthia had agreed to hold the connection for when it was needed. We met in her office 2 days later. I brought the folders. She went through them with a focus that made it clear she'd been waiting for this specific conversation. She told me that what Florence had assembled was not proof in the legal sense, not yet, but it was a roadmap, a detailed, methodical roadmap, and that with a forensic accountant and the right motions, it was likely enough to reopen the asset disclosure in my divorce proceedings. What followed was 4 months of legal process that I will not pretend was easy or fast or emotionally simple. There were weeks where I went to work and came home and opened documents on my laptop until midnight and woke up at 6 and did it again. There were depositions. There were motions. There was a hearing in a wood-paneled room in downtown Toronto where I sat very still while a judge asked questions that my husband's lawyer answered with a smoothness I found nauseating. But Florence's documentation held. A forensic accountant confirmed what she'd mapped out. The shell structure my husband's company had used was found to be a deliberate concealment of marital assets. The judge ordered a full disclosure. My husband's business partner, who had been instrumental in setting up the arrangement, was referred for a separate financial investigation. The settlement, when it finally came, was not a small number. Between the equity I was owed, the assets that were brought back into disclosure, and the terms the judge imposed for what he called an egregious failure of financial transparency, I walked out of that process with more than I'd had when I walked into my marriage. Not because I was lucky, because Florence had spent years making sure that if I ever needed it, the truth would be on record. My sister and I have not spoken. I'm not sure we will, or at least not for a very long time. My mother has stopped calling since I declined to attend Christmas. Those relationships belong to a version of my life I'm still processing, and I don't know yet what any of them will look like from the other side of all of this. I'm not trying to rush that understanding. My husband received a formal reprimand from the court and is under a financial compliance order for the next 5 years. His business partner is facing charges I won't go into detail about because the matter is still before the courts. I don't feel satisfaction about any of it exactly. It's more like watching a natural consequence arrive, something that was always going to land eventually because Florence had made sure it couldn't be buried. I moved in March, not far. I found a place in the east end of Toronto, a small house with a real backyard, which matters because my dog is getting older and she deserves grass. I painted the kitchen a color called antique linen, which is almost exactly the yellow of early morning light in late April, and I stood at the counter one Saturday with my coffee and thought about Florence in her farmhouse, alone all those years, keeping her careful records, writing her careful letters, believing that love sometimes looks like paperwork and patience and saying nothing until the moment you can say everything. She never had a big family or a long marriage or a full house at Christmas. She had her work and her savings and a filing system that turned out to be worth more than anyone around her understood. She was called strange by people who hadn't thought clearly about what they were actually seeing. I think about her more than I expected to. I think about the card she sent me when I graduated. Practical, brief, a $20 bill tucked inside because she didn't believe in gift cards. I think about the fact that she spent the last years of her life organizing documents on my behalf without ever telling me, without any guarantee I'd need them, without any expectation of being thanked. I'm not the person I was the afternoon I stood at the bottom of those stairs and counted to 15 before walking up. That woman was holding everything together with her fingernails and hadn't slept properly in months and thought she was about to lose everything she'd built. I still have her exhaustion sometimes. Still have the particular flinch that comes from having been blindsided by people you trusted entirely. Healing doesn't move in a straight line. It backtracks and stalls and occasionally surprises you at 8 in the morning when you realize you've gone 3 days without thinking about it. But I am still here, and Florence made sure that when the ground fell out from under me, she'd already built a floor underneath it. Some people protect the people they love quietly, without asking for anything back, without even being sure their effort will ever be used. I hope she knew somehow that it was. I've thought a lot about why things ended the way they did, not just the legal outcome, but all of it. Why my husband felt entitled to plan an exit while I was working double shifts. Why my sister let it go on for 14 months without a word. Why Florence, a woman most of our family dismissed as odd and solitary, was the only one who saw clearly. I don't think what happened to me was random. I think people show you who they are in small ways long before the large ones, and I had been choosing not to look. That's not self-blame. I want to be careful about that distinction, because there's a version of this story where I spend the rest of my life cataloging my own naivety, and that version doesn't serve anyone. But I do think honesty requires me to say that the warning signs were there and that I'd learned somewhere along the way to smooth them over rather than name them. That is something I'm still working on. What Florence showed me, without ever sitting across from me and saying it directly, because that wasn't her way, was that integrity is a practice, not a declaration. She didn't announce her values. She lived them quietly in a farmhouse outside of Owen Sound, in a filing system no one knew existed, in a credit union account she built over 40 years by spending almost nothing on herself. She had decided at some point, I'll never be able to pinpoint, that the most meaningful thing she could do with her life was make sure that the people she loved were protected, even if they never knew it, even if she never got to see it matter. That kind of clear-eyed, patient love is rare. It requires a particular kind of intelligence, not cleverness, not strategy, but the slow accumulation of understanding. Florence understood how money worked, how legal structures could be used to hide things, how paperwork could either bury a person or save them. She understood this not because it was dramatic or exciting, but because she'd spent decades paying attention to the world around her with a level of care that most people reserve for things that feel more urgent. Her folders were methodical. Her letter was precise. She had thought it all through. And then there's what it took for me to actually use what she left. I won't pretend that was easy. There were nights in that Scarborough apartment when I almost convinced myself that it wasn't worth the fight, that the legal process would be too slow, too expensive, too uncertain, and that it would be easier to just take the $90,000 and go quietly. Every person who has ever been wronged by someone with more resources than them knows that feeling. The system is designed to exhaust you into settling. Getting through it required something I had to find in myself incrementally, in small, daily decisions to keep going, to make one more call, read one more document, show up for one more appointment. I came out of this with a house in the East End and a dog who gets to sleep on the couch and a kitchen painted the color of early morning. I also came out of it with a much clearer sense of what I will and won't accept going forward. In relationships, in how people speak to me, in what I'm willing to explain away. Florence gave me the financial ground to stand on. But the standing itself was something I had to choose. She was called strange by people who weren't paying close enough attention to what they were actually seeing. I hope she knew, wherever she is now, that it mattered. That the care she put into those folders reached the person she intended. That her life's quiet work was not wasted. I'm still figuring out who I am on the other side of all this, but I think she'd be pleased to know I'm asking the question.